Hey guys, and welcome to the last biology module before the summer break. Woohoo! Just to begin with, a quick sum up of the two models we looked at yesterday, the two types of population growth that we can have. And then I have a few new concepts for you, and then there's a worksheet for the rest of the module, and then that's it. And then when we come back after the summer break, we'll continue to cover topic C5. There is something about how to manage fish stock populations, and we're going to use what we have learned about how to model population growth to figure out how to manage fish stock, commercial fish stocks. And then there is a few modules on the phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle. And then we're done with the option, but the last bits are for after the summer break. So yeah, like I said, just a quick sum up of population growth. So we saw yesterday exponential growth looking like this if we draw the graph, and this only happens if there is no limits, if there is all the resources the population need, all the food, no competition for space, all those things, then we'll see exponential growth. So this will normally only be in the beginning of when a population is increasing in size, and then at some point the growth would cease and level out, and the population would reach its carrying capacity. And in that case, we would have logistic growth instead of exponential growth. Yes. We could also divide this type of growth into different phases. So we would refer to this initial phase as a lag phase, where the population is sort of not really increasing yet, but settling into the environment, especially if it's a bacteria population, right? Then the cells would grow in size and they would adapt to the environment in the test tube, and then eventually they would start to divide, and we would then see exponential growth. This would be then called the exponential phase. And then we would reach the stationary phase, where the population size is somewhat stable. And then actually at some point, if it's a bacteria population growing in a petri dish or in a test tube, they would also start to die, and we would then see the population size decrease again, and we would refer to that as a decline phase. So lag phase, exponential phase, stationary phase, and decline phase could also sometimes be used to describe this type of growth. Yeah, so that was just a quick brush up. And then this is a mnemonic found on BioNinja, because we talked a little bit about this yesterday, that there are some factors that are density dependent and other that are density independent. There was just one question in the worksheet yesterday about this, that some factors would affect population size, even whether the population is very large or very small, right? So natural disasters, global rise in temperature, for instance, weather, more extreme weather conditions, stuff like that. Doesn't matter if there is 20 squirrels or 2,000 squirrels, they would still all be affected by this. So that would be density independent factors. And then we would, of course, have all the density dependent factors, right? So if the population is large, then of course there's only a limited nutrient supply, so they might eventually run out of food. If it's a very dense population, pathogens might spread more easily in the population. And again, if we talk about test tubes or petri dishes, or even maybe even a small nature reserve, then if the population is very big, then waste would accumulate. So these up here are density dependent factors. And then there are two concepts that you should know about. And And those are referred to as top-down and bottom-up control of ecosystems or of the population size of a specific species. So if we look at this diagram, it actually shows both things, right? So we have, this is a simple food chain. We have producers down here, plants. Then we have herbivores or primary consumers and secondary consumers, predators up here. And if we then take a look at the size of the grasshopper population, then it could be controlled from the bottom of the food chain if what limits the population size is availability of the food that it eats, then it's bottom up controlled. If it's controlled by the spider population, by how many of them are being eaten, then it would instead be top-down controlled. Yeah, and again, if we look at the plant species, the population size of these could be affected by, of course, the herbivores. So herbivory as an example of top-down control. But the size of the plant population could also be bottom-up controlled, because if there is a lot of nutrients, for instance, in the soil, then we would refer to that as a bottom-up control of the population size of this plant. So top-down or bottom-up. And besides the herbivory example, one example that is mentioned specifically in your guide is algae blooms. And algae blooms are also an example of bottom-up control of the size of a certain population, in this case the algae population. So if we look at the diagram here, if a lot of fertilizer is applied on fields and enter, like in this case, a little pond through the water leaching into this little pond, then a lot of inorganic nutrients would end up in the pond, and the phytoplankton, the microscopic algae living in the pond, would take up a lot of these nutrients. And if those nutrients were before the limiting factor for the size of this population, which they often are, then supplying them with more would increase the size of the algae population. So if a lot of nutrients enter the pond, we would see a large increase in the size of the algae population. And if it's very big increase in population size, then we refer to this as an algae bloom. And the reason that algae blooms are not something we usually want is because then we get a lot of biomass, huge increase in biomass of these algae, and eventually they die, they fall to the bottom of the pond, and when they're decomposed by bacteria down here, those bacteria would use up all the oxygen at the bottom of the pond, and that would of course be bad for whatever small animals and other plants that might live down here. Another bad thing about algae blooms is that they would sometimes cover sort of the surface of the pond entirely, so that other plants living sort of at the bottom of the pond would not be able to get the sunlight that they need. And some of these plants would usually be habitats for a lot of animal species like fishes and macroinvertebrates and stuff like that. So we would usually like to avoid these algae blooms, and one way of doing it is to, of course, control the supply of nutrients, right? Yeah. But just to sum up, algae blooms are examples of bottom-up control of a population size. And then to sum up the whole top-down, bottom-up control of population sizes, I have this graph for you. So what I want you to do in a minute is to pause the video and then evaluate the statement, the moose population is top-down controlled. So pause for a minute, think, and then I will talk again when you start the video. Okay, so I have circled some things here in green and red, right? So my green circles are areas in the graph that I would say support the statement that the moose population is top-down controlled. So if we look at the graph here, we can see that there is a lot of wolves, at least here, right? And at the same time, the moose population is low. So this might indicate that when there's a lot of wolves, they would top-down control the moose population. And over here as well, it seems that when there is a rise in wolf population, we end up with a decrease in the moose population. So this might again indicate that when there's a growing number of wolves, then at some point the moose population would decrease. We can also find, and there's more than one example, but we could also find examples that sort of contradicts the statement, right? Because in this case, the wolf population increase, but so does the moose population. So this would be a counter argument using the data in the graph. Yeah, so I think that's it for now. And then there is a worksheet. And then you will get to listen to my voice again during the EE days. There's a video again. But I still want to make sure that I wish all of you a very nice summer. So I'm going to do that now. And then I really look forward to seeing you all back in the classroom in August. Bye for now.